Hello, welcome to day 25, and I am very excited because we've gotten to the point where we'll be working on something very cool. And today we'll be talking about class and object. Now, I know you've heard about object-oriented programming. Of course, it is a way to combine both data and code. That is pretty much what we are going to be doing in this lesson. And let's dive into it. Now, just like the way you declare variables and also function, you can also define your class. And once you create the class, you can then call it the class object. But for us to start, let's understand some basic things. In the first instance, we have our class keyword. Then you have the name of the class, followed by a column. Okay? Just like the way you have the div keyword for the function, followed by the name, and also variable without having any keyword in the beginning. One thing to take note of is, for you to declare a class, the class name needs to be a camel case. In other words, the first letter or the first word needs to start with capital letter. This is a class. All right, this is the conventional way of defining a class. Now that you have the idea of how to define a class name, let us try to define one for ourselves. And for us to do that, let us write a constructor. A constructor function in a class is what actually triggers the class to perform certain instructions. Let's see how that works. Now, I'm just going to declare a class of person. Now, we know that when you're defining a person has name, has age, has height. A person has several attributes. But let us start with the name. Let's see how that works. So I'm going to call my class keyword, then declare person. Now, I have my column. When I enter, you can see that there is, of course, an indentation declaring the block of code. Now, for us to really declare our constructor, it's actually a function. I know that you have idea of what a function is, but this is a bit different. And let's see what I'm talking about. I call the div double underscore, then init, then another double underscore with my bracket. Now take a look at what we have. It's pretty much like a function, but the only thing is we have the init. You can just say this init as if you're saying, hey, you want to initialize the class. Now that you have this function, we can then do anything. But first, let's say we want to store the name of a user. If you look at the function very well, you can see self. What the self is doing, just like we learned about parameters in function, you're passing the entire functionality or the entire data back to this function. And let's see how we can really tie that together. For us to declare username, we need to call the self, right? Then name equals to, let's say, we are saying John. Okay. Now, this is almost the same thing as normal variable, name John. It's a normal variable. However, what you're doing is you want to tie this variable to the class. And because of that, we introduce self. Okay? Now, once you're able to do this pretty much, you've declared your class object. Now, let's look at objects properly. So let's say, for instance, we want to maybe store some things, store whatever value we have in the class in a variable. And for us to really store that, Let us understand what it means to create an object in Python. We use the constructor, which is fine. Remember then that you're able to call when you want to instantiate a list or when you want to instantiate a set. You could create a set with something like this with the constructor. Let's say our sets. You can just say our sets. Then list. You can see we've done something similar to this in the past. This means as well that you can, because you created your own class, you could actually reference it. This is a Python built-in class. We've created our own, so we can also call it. And for us to call it, we can just say the person. Let's declare a variable. The person. Then all we need to do is to call our class. To call our class, make sure that you have the parentheses. Now that you've done that, how about we just try to print the type? Let's check what type do we have. So I'm just going to call the print function, then call the person. In fact, we need to wrap that in type. I'm just going to say type. Yes. So if we are correct, then we are going to see what type is this, our class. Let's run our code and see what we get. You can see we are having the class of main person. Now, the main you're seeing here is what Python really references as your main code, like your main program, which is this, our document here, our main program, right? Then it is pointing to the class which you created. Now that we've seen that what we've created really is a class, how about we call a method inside? Remember, you've created a Python method inside of your class. We can reference it. All we need to do in our print function, in fact, we can duplicate this. And instead of using type here, we can just remove the type. Now, we can just point to the method that we want. Now, we want to print this variable name called name. All I need to do is just a period, then name. If we run it, let's see what we get. You can see we have the value of John. This is cool. What if you choose to update the value? Like you just want to update the value? What do? It is possible. So all we need to do is to say, we can go ahead and say the person dot name, then assign it, let's say this time around, we want to give it field. If we save it, let's call the print function again. Let's see what we get. If we run it, of course, you should see that you're able to get field. This is really cool. Now, remember that when creating a function, it is possible to pass in a variable, like you could pass in parameters into the function. Same way, you can also pass in values into the class. And let me show you what I'm talking about. So let's say we want to further, let me just comment out all of those, right? And let's say we want to further work on, in fact, let me just comment this as well. And I am going to say passing parameters to class. This should be A. So what do we get? I'm going to paste the class that we had. Now, one thing to note is I told you that the moment you remove the self, this becomes a normal variable. And one thing with normal variable in class is that the class is not really aware of them. So they are not really tied to the class. But let's see how we can even declare a variable as a parameter in our class. All we need to do is to add a parameter of name to our function. Now, one thing to understand is that this variable name is different from this name. Remember, this is tied to your class. However, this is just a standalone variable. In other words, we can change this and just call it name. So whatever we are passing to the function, right, Python is just going to print it here or reference it here, which is very cool. This can be any name, right? It can be age, it can be anything. Of course, we're going to look at more options. Now that we have a variable in our class, how do we reference it? Okay, to reference it, all we need to do, let's say we want to pass in John. Let's declare the variable of John. Let's declare the variable of Mary. Let's declare the variable of Phil. Okay. Now we'll call the person. Then we pass in the value. We can say this is John. Okay. Then we can also say this should be Mary. Then we can say this should be Phil. Okay. So how about we go ahead and just print, right? Print all of those and see what we get. If everything works well, the class is going to take in this value, right, as a parameter. And of course, print it here and we'll have the right value. So let's say now we call the print function. In the print function, we're going to call John, right, which is this first variable, John. Then we want the name. We want to print the name. The same thing as well to Mary. The same thing to Phil. This should be small p. If everything really goes well, we should have Python print those names accordingly. You can see we have John, Mary, and Phil. The difference between this class, right, and this very static class here is that we had coded the name John, right? But what we've done here is we've done it in a way that just passing the name, and of course the name will be referenced to the appropriate variable in the class name. This is really cool because oftentimes you don't know the name of your user, you don't know their age, you just want to be able to reference it and store them dynamically. Another thing we can do is to assign non-value to our parameter. Okay, and why do you want to do that? Sometimes you might not have any value and you don't want your class to throw error, or you want to be able to identify every time there's value in your class. To do that, you can use the non keyword. The non-value is to indicate that the variable or the class is empty. And how do we do that? Let's say we go ahead and maybe write another print function. This time around, let's say we even have another variable name that says no name. And we don't pass in anything here. Let's say we call the no name. If we run it, you can see that Python is throwing an error, right? It's saying missing a required potential argument, which is name. In some instances, you don't want your code to throw this error, all right? And that is when it's possible for us to use the non-value. And how do we use the non-value? All we need to do is to say the name, the parameter here, equals to none. Okay, if we run the same code again, and let's see what we get. You can see it prints without error. However, we are getting the value of none. Okay, so your code shouldn't really throw error because you do not have value. Now that you have an understanding that it is possible for us to add a non-value whenever a value doesn't exist, we can also do more. In fact, we can add more parameters. Let's see what we can do. Let's say our user has age. Of course, we're just going to say comma as well. Age. Let's give age as well the value of none. Is our user married? We also want to check if married. Let's give the value of false. So the default is going to be false. Is false is incorrect? Yes. Now, what we are checking really is if the user is married, the user should let us know. But by default, it's going to be false. Remember, this is a Boolean value. Now that we have all of those, another thing we can do is to reference them. So we can just go ahead and say age, this is going to be age, and this is going to be married. This is going to be married. Perfect. So this is really saying that it is possible as well to also reference as many as we want. So right now we have two additional fields. Let's see how we can really reference those. It means that here I can actually check John. Does John have age? If there's age for John. Now I can check, does John have age? So I can say maybe John's age is 25. Then let's say he's married. So we can just say true. If we print, let's see what we get. We're getting just John and we're getting just Mary. If you can guess what's wrong, it has to be in our print function. So what if in John here, in the print function here, we'll also do for age, then we'll do for married. Just run it and see. So you can see John, 25, true, is married. This is really cool. All right. Why not just go ahead and try to populate these two, Mary and Phil, right? Give them age and also check if they are married. Now, let us talk about the actual thing. Class, like I mentioned earlier, is where the object-oriented programming really happens. In other words, we can combine data and also code. You can call the code instructions. And how do we do that? So far, we've been able to grab the user data, right? At least this can be, you can grab a car data, you can grab data for games, whatever it is. But in this instance, we are looking at a person. And what we've had here are instances of a person. So let's say now we want to add the code, like some things that should happen. Okay. I'm just going to, let me copy this. We're still going to need this as well. But let's comment all of those. Let's comment all of this. What's wrong? Let's comment all of this. So now let's write another comment. In the comments, what we're trying to do right now is class method, the action. Let's reference our class as well. Then what we need right now is the method, like what should happen. In the event where you have things like this, you want to perform some actions, right? And to declare a method, all we need to do is to declare function and pass the feature of the class to the function. And how do we do that? Let us see the possible ways. So I can just say def, of course. What we just need, maybe for an example, let's print. Maybe we can just say hello function. You need to always pass in self, right? In fact, PyCharm is going to do that for you automatically. Then let's print hello. We can just say hello. It is nice to meet you. Okay. Now let's try to perform some things as well. So this time around, I think I am going to need to print John. But before that, let's bring in John variable. Yes. Okay, now, so we're just calling John as well and calling the person's class, passing its all the attribute for John. And the print function is doing the same thing, printing the name and whatever it is we want it to do. So in fact, what if we go ahead and just call John alone? Okay. If we go ahead and call John alone, you can see nothing gets to happen. Let's call John and other parameters. And let's see. You can see nothing is being done, right? We can't even really see the print function. Okay. And that's because we are not referencing the method yet. I think we need to correct this hello to be hello. Yes. Okay, how do you reference a method in a class? Pretty simple. I'm just going to say reference method. And to reference method, all we need is to just call the hello function. You can see we call the method like call John, right? Then we are pointing at hello. Let's see if we're going to get the appropriate printout. You can see hello, nice to meet you. Nice. So how about we choose to also do all this display, like all those print function, like all those things that we wrote. How about we want to write the display method in our class? Just like the way we have the hello. So all I need to do is to declare another method. I can just call that dev display. And of course, I am going to then write whatever I want it to do. So first, let's say we want it to display name. So we're going to call the print function name. Then we want self.name, right? You can already see that it's pointing to this. Let's duplicate this. We want age. Just call age. Then finally, we want the marital status. Married. Then we want to call married. Cool. So in other words, we can actually come here, instead of writing print function every time, right? We can just come here all the way and call the display method for John. Display. Let's comment out this one. If we run it, let's see if everything gets printed for us. So you can see pretty much just on a go, you're able to write a method that does that. So no amount of data that you pass into the class. So let's say we are doing Mary. In fact, let's comment out this print. Our class already do that for us. So let's say Mary. Now, let's say Mary is 25 years old. 25. Then let's say he's not married. Since he's not married, we can just leave it. Okay. Now, what we can do is to call the method for Mary as well. So we can just say Mary. And if we run it, you can see the detail for Mary. Mary, age 25, and is not married. This is really very handy. And of course, I know now that when you hear the term object-oriented programming, it is the way to store data and also perform some functions with them. Your class can be as dynamic as you want. It all depends on the functions that you want it to run. But just know that it is possible for you to combine both data and code as well. And all of the things we've learned so far are things that we combine to do all of this. A function, variable, print function, and also the class. This is really cool. Before we move forward, I want you to just go ahead and check the description to see the project that you have for this very course. Make sure you try it out. If you have any question, do let us know. Congratulations. If you've gone this far, you've really tried. And if you followed all of the steps and you've done all of the practices that I've added for you, then I must applaud you for that, because you've done a great thing. And I can tell you that you would never regret it. Now, in the last 5 days, right, what we are going to be looking at is Django. Now, Django is a framework that allows us to write web application using Python. Now, in this very lesson, we are going to be looking at everything we need to know about Django. You see, Django is not something that you should be worried about, because if you understand the way Python works, which are some of the things we've learned during the course of these lessons, like I said, whatever you do, make sure that you share on your social media handles, and don't forget to copy us. And of course, if you still have issues fixing anything, Google it and ask questions. You can ask us as well. So in the next few days, we're going to be looking at the component of Django, and we're going to be performing CRUD. Now, CRUD in programming term is what we call create, update, read, and delete, right? It's just a way for you to say, okay, I want to add new content to my database. At some point, I want to delete it. At some point, I want to render it to the user. So that's a cool thing, and those are things that we're going to be doing. And for us to do that, we're going to be building employee directory. Now, the employee directory project was created last year. So if you're interested in learning how to create the front end as to the HTML, JavaScript, and the CSS, of course, check the link attached to the description, and you should be able to take that as well. But if you're cool and you just want to know how the backend logic will work, let us dive into this Django journey and let's see how things work. So thank you. And in today's session, we'll be setting up our Django environment, and also we'll be doing some few things and writing some of the things that will help us to build the application. So let's dive into it.